So the Local Foods College is just a webinar program that we put on that we started to do it twice a year now, so in the winter and then in the fall. Usually in January, February we'll start up again. And we're just trying to provide some information to those who are out there trying to grow food and eat well and maybe make a business out of it. And so we use a variety of topics and just try to deliver the information in a way that's convenient for you all in this format. We have a number of people who they listen to these afterwards, so there's a pretty good contingent of that as well. We have two main speakers. I don't know if I introduced myself, so I should do that. My name is Jake Overgaard, and I'm an extension educator in Winona County. I do a fair number of things related to local foods and also do a lot of nutrient management work with growers in my area. But our main speakers are Valerie Gamble, who is with the Department of Agriculture, and then Annalisa Hultberg is a fellow extension educator based up in the St. Paul area, and they are here tonight to talk to us about good ag practices, or GAPs, and then FSMA, which is the Food Safety Modernization Act, and how that impacts farmers. So two rather important topics that are getting a lot of buzz nowadays. So I'm going to pass things on to Annalisa, and you should have the power now.
Great. Thank you, Jake. Yep. Thanks for having us this evening. Hello, everybody. We're both here. You can see us both. I'm Annalisa. I'll be speaking first. Val is there, too. She'll be speaking next. So, as Jake said, I'm an extension educator in food safety based in St. Paul, but I do work statewide. And I've been at the university for about 8 years, and I manage the on-farm food safety education program along with my colleague Ann Sawyer. And I should say that Jake has also done a lot of work in this area as well. So the topic tonight is food safety, FSMA, the Food Safety Modernization Act, GAP audits, and how they all relate. So some of our major objectives are to help. We hope that you leave with the basics of the FSMA Produce Safety Rule, and if you have not heard of that, you will know a lot more about that. The difference between what basic GAPs are, what a GAP audit is, and what the FSMA Produce Safety Rule is. And then what I'll be speaking about at the beginning is really just the importance of some of these practices in our food system and on farms, and really hope you leave with, we're not going to have time, this is an all-day training, we're not going to have time to get into the specifics of different manure use and timing and water testing and all the what the practices actually are, but we hope that you would leave with an interest in learning more about that, potentially attending one of the trainings where we will do much more of a deeper dive into what those practices are. And learning about some of those resources available here at the university, and then also at the Produce Safety Program at the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. So just a very brief overview about our program here at the U of M. That is our website there at the top, and we provide those are kind of our main audience. So basically, if you're growing food, you're our audience. So that is the largest commercial fruit and vegetable growers down to school gardens and small-scale gardens. We don't generally work that much with homeowners. Our focus really is on protecting public health, and so we kind of say if you're selling or giving food to others, you should really consider food safety in those growing environments, and then so that's who we work with. But we also work with the buyers, so food hubs to help them. Farm to school, I've worked pretty extensively with Minneapolis Public Schools, for example, to help them understand some of the practices that growers can and should be taking to protect the food from contamination. So this is how we do it. We do workshops. I'd say on average they do about 15 3 to 6 hour long GAPs workshops around the state every year. We just do technical assistance, answering all kinds of emails, phone calls, what should I get my water tested for, those kind of things. And then most recently, we're doing the FSMA Produce Safety Rule trainings along with the Department of Ag that you'll hear more about. And then also, we have a food safety plan template. So if you're interested after this or after attending a training about writing a food safety plan template, or a food safety plan, we have developed a template so you aren't starting from scratch. And I'm happy to say that actually that template is used around the country. I've been in other states and they say, oh yeah, we use that template. So that's exciting. This is what our workshops look like. They look like anything from, in the bottom right there is one of our FSMA grower trainings. So that is about 40 people. It's sit down, it's a standardized training that is mandated to be that way, but we also do work on the farm, and we'll sit there for a couple hours, talk through your practices, do farm visits, a lot of farm visits. The bottom left is building food safety, building hand washing stands. The top left was actually translated simultaneously into Spanish. That's at Featherstone Farm, and there was quite a few of their workers were H-2A visa workers that were Spanish speakers, so they hired a translator and translated it all into Spanish. So we also I should definitely say that if you are interested and you have a group of people, we'd be happy to come out and do a farm walkthrough. So this is our first poll question. If you could say, indicate yes or no, have you ever attended a farm food safety workshop or training? Okay, 2 yes, 1 no. All right, and the next question, true or false? So for true, give us a green check. Food safety audits are required by law for all farmers selling to large buyers like a school. What do you think? Is that true? Green check. All right. We have 1 yes, 1 no. That means we have somebody who's not voting. Well, okay. We'll come back to that and see what you think the answer is after this. But just a little bit about why we're talking about this. So good agricultural practices are voluntary things that farmers do. They're based in science. They're things like washing your hands. They're things like making sure that you're properly composting animal-based manure. There are things like not working when you're sick and training your employees to do the same. So they're really just practices. It's not a law. And the reason we're doing that is because people are eating more vegetables. They're often eating these vegetables raw. And if it doesn't take very many cells of some of these pathogens, such as E. coli or Listeria, to be ingested and potentially making you very sick. So people who are young or very old or immune compromised, or even more, there's even a higher possibility that they could become sick from those vegetables. The other thing is your reputation as a farm. So if there was an outbreak traced back to you, that would not be good for your farm, and also just wouldn't be good for our general local food system. So we've seen time and time again, and I feel very passionate about supporting our local food systems, and getting everyone up to speed on these practices is really one way we can do that, so that there isn't an incident which kind of casts a cloud over our local food systems. Also, I've worked with farms long enough to hear them say over and over, you know what, at first I thought this was some government headache, and then I realized it's actually really improved systems on my farm and made it run more smoothly and saved me time and money in the end. So coming from their mouths, they've definitely said it has improved efficiency to set up that system. Like I said, these high-risk populations, the other thing is people say, I've never made anyone sick. You don't know, looking at someone, if they are immune compromised. So it's really important that we take these steps regardless of who we are selling to, but especially if you're selling to someone like schools or a nursing home, we want to make double sure that we've done everything in our power to make sure that that food doesn't have any contamination on it. I think it's kind of interesting that 1 in 6 people will have a foodborne illness as per the CDC. So this is pretty common, and the other thing is it's often underreported. So we often are not going to the doctor if you have things like a bad stomach ache and diarrhea and vomiting. It's not being reported, so it's likely that that could be even higher. So which produce items are most commonly implicated in outbreaks? Well, the first item is sprouts. So we don't really even work with sprouters. They're kind of a category in and of themselves, but things like leafy greens, cantaloupe, if you remember the cantaloupe outbreak, tomatoes, fresh berries, and herbs. Those are the most commonly implicated. That's not to say that the other ones can't have some contamination on them. They certainly do occasionally. But those leafy greens have lots of nooks and crannies and large surface area. They also grow near the ground, and they're often eaten raw. So for all of those reasons, they are some of the most high-risk products. So I'd like to show this as a way to just think about prioritization. So when you're working on your farm, think about washing your hands really well before you're handling those leafy greens. If you're going to go pick potatoes, dig potatoes for a day, certainly wash your hands, but you know, maintaining that cleanliness is potentially less important because those potatoes are going to be cooked. So where is the bacteria in the farm environment? It can be anywhere, and the next slide shows, these are some of the things that we're talking about today. The bacteria is some of the most common, but also those human viruses that are coming from, potentially from sick workers. And here is really where it's coming from on the farm. So the people working on your farm, and the people have hands, and people are dirty, and people poop. So if you're not washing your hands sufficiently, there's that fecal-oral route, which is as gross as it sounds, and you can potentially contaminate a large amount of produce. The soil, so there's the soil-borne pathogens that can have contaminations from manure or runoff. Then you have the water, which is one of the most common routes of contamination on the farm. That can contain all kinds of things. Recently, there's been a lot of flooding, but also think about water. So runoff, think about adjacent fields. If you have any sort of livestock, that water running into the fields. Also thinking about water that we're using in a post-harvest scenario, so water for washing our vegetables. And animals. So these are any sort of livestock, but also wildlife, and also pets. So totally okay to have a dog on the farm, but the dogs do need to stay out of the produce growing areas. I've kind of talked about this, but it is important to think about why produce especially can be high risk. So think about that netted cantaloupe there. Those bacteria really can foster well in there. Think about the seeds on the outside of the strawberry and those leafy greens. One case study recently in Wisconsin, there was a salmonella outbreak, and the last number I heard was that at least 15 people were ill, and this was a small diversified vegetable farm, and they were harvesting fresh shell peas, and they were using older equipment that was generally equipment that was used for harvesting peas that were going for processing. And so then there would be a kill step, but they used the same equipment, and there was not good cleanliness or sanitation. Often in these kind of outbreaks, it's stacking of things. It's not one small mistake where an otherwise great operation kind of just makes a mistake for an evening or something. It was they had a history of pretty bad practices, and it sickened quite a few people, and it's likely that quite a few more people were sick. And now no one died. It was salmonella, just probably had diarrhea and vomiting, but not good, and also really not good for farmers markets. If our goal here is to support farmers markets, which it is, these are not the kind of things that we want coming out of our farmers market. So that is why basic practices go a long way. And we remember the cantaloupe outbreak. That was very serious. Listeria can be very serious, also very serious for expecting mothers. And then the spinach outbreak. Spinach sales are still down. The spinach outbreak really was a huge, huge industry shocker, and millions of dollars in losses for lots of farms. So to be clear here, these GAPs are these basic practices we're talking about. They're science-based practices. They're not any sort of a law. Then we have this FSMA produce safety rule that Val will talk about in a second. That is what is now mandated for some farms, but it is based in these practices. It was not made up out of thin air. Then there is an audit, which I'll talk about next, which was predated the FSMA Produce Safety Rule. Some people have an audit in the state. There's about maybe 10 vegetable farms that have a GAP audit. And that is when you pay an auditor to come to your farm to verify that you're doing these practices. And the reason that you would do that is if a buyer requires it, not a law, going back to our question. So a GAP audit, what does it cost? Who does it? It is not a law. It is you calling up the friendly folks at the Department of Agriculture and saying, I would like an audit. My buyer, may be a large produce wholesaler that you'd like to sell your spinach to, said, you need a GAP audit on that spinach before I can buy it. And you said, oh, okay. So you call up the Department of Ag. The Department of Ag sends an auditor. You pay for that. It's about $108 an hour. And it costs roughly $500, $700 for most smaller farms. There is a cost share that's available for, from the Department of Ag. However, once you pass that audit, so up to 75% of that cost share, of that cost will be reimbursed to you. So the out-of-pocket costs are relatively low. The first question on the audit is, do you have a written food safety plan, which is why we developed the food safety plan template to help you pass that audit. I would say it is not nearly as difficult as people would think it would be. It is quite basic, and most of our farms are doing most of these practices. It's the record keeping that gets people. If you haven't had an audit before, you might not have a reason to keep all of the records. But once you develop that record keeping system, it's really not a challenge. So I'm really seeing more and more farms seeking these audits because they want to sell to wholesale distributors, large school districts, large college campuses. These guys are going to require a GAP audit. So just so you know, it is not anything that's out of the reach of any farm if they want it. However, this is not something that you would get just because. This truly, you get this if a buyer is requiring it. So the audits have been around for a while. Now, over the last few years, the Food Safety Modernization Act Produce Safety Rule has been rolled out, which now mandates some of the same practices in an audit. So I'm going to pass the mic to Val, but before I stop, if you have any questions, you could ask them now.
I don't have any in the chat yet.
Okay.
I did just put out a reminder to folks if you want to just put the questions in the chat again, and you can either send it to all participants, or I think you have the option of sending it directly to me, Jake. So get those questions in if you have them. I really like that quote, Annalisa, or your line, people are dirty. It made me laugh. All right.
Okay, can you hear me? All right, thank you. So as Jake said earlier, I'm Valerie Gamble. I work with the Department of Agriculture. I'm the Produce Safety Program Manager. So we work very closely at the Produce Safety Program with Annalisa at the university. Right now we're focusing on education and outreach around the FSMA Produce Safety Rule. The ultimate main part of our program will be on-farm produce inspections, but that's still, well, starting next summer and then several years out before we really get that part of the program up and running. Our first inspections will be very educationally focused, so outreach will continue for several more years. But just building out of what Annalisa was covering right before the GAP audit there, so talking about the bacteria and viruses and parasites, but specifically those outbreaks, that outbreak history and the scientific data that was collected around those outbreaks is what ultimately led to the formation of the Produce Safety Rule. So as part of the Food Safety Modernization Act, the FDA determined that based on scientific evidence, we needed controls in place because of that outbreak history. So with our first question here, have you heard of the FSMA Produce Safety Rule? and yes would be the green arrow. Give it a few more seconds. Okay, so right now we've got 2 people saying yes and 1 person that says no. There we go. So the next question, true or false, the FSMA Produce Safety Rule will apply to all farmers who grow produce. So if you've heard of the rule before, would you say yes, this rule will apply to everyone, or no, it won't? It will just apply to some produce growers. All right. I see 1 yes and 2 no's. All right, so 1 true and 2 falses. 3 falses. There we go. All right, so just a little background on FSMA. The FDA's Food Safety Modernization Act, or FSMA, is a set of new federal regulations. So the act itself directed the FDA to produce food safety laws, and those food safety laws cover 7 different areas. So produce safety is 1. We have a couple others, the preventive controls for human food, preventive controls for animal food. There's a new regulation that just focuses on safe sanitary transportation, new standards for imported food coming into the U.S. So the FSMA was the first comprehensive update to food safety laws in the United States since 1938. So it had been quite a while before we had had an overhaul, and when they enacted FSMA, they went ahead and created new regulations that would cover basically all of our food chain, from the farm all the way through the grocery stores. This Food Safety Modernization Act was signed, as you can see in the picture, on January 4th, 2011 by President Barack Obama. And here's the complete list of the rules, a couple of those I had just mentioned. In terms of the work that the Department of Agriculture does, we do have regulatory authority over the preventive controls for human food, preventive controls for animal food, the produce safety rule, and a little bit on the sanitary transportation. Beyond that, most of these rules will be implemented by the FDA. And we do work closely with them in all of these areas, but in terms of kind of who's taking the lead on those within the state, that's how it's divided out. So specifically, the produce safety rule portion of the Food Safety Modernization Act, as I said, is establishing science-based standards. So again, looking at that scientific history and the outbreak history, these are standards that were developed to have safe growing or encourage safe growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of fruits and vegetables grown for human consumption. These are the main areas that are covered by the produce safety rule. So the key requirements fall into these spaces. So there are requirements around water used in agricultural settings, so for growing, packing, harvesting, and holding. There are requirements for biological soil amendments of animal origin. There's a specific section, subpart M, within the produce safety rule that just covers sprouts. And that is, again, based on outbreak history. Sprouts, unfortunately, have been implicated in a number of produce-related outbreaks. So they've been kind of classified as a riskier produce item, and therefore they have their own special set of requirements that include a little bit more water and environmental testing than other types of produce. There are also requirements around domesticated and wild animals on farms, requirements for worker training, health and hygiene, and then requirements for equipment, tools, and buildings. The rule is actually written in a way that not all produce farmers are covered. So we tend to describe it as 3 different buckets that produce farmers can fall into or under, depending on how you want to look at the bucket. They can be either excluded from the rule completely, so they wouldn't be covered. They could be covered, but then have a qualified exemption, which basically means that 99% of the rule does not apply to them. Or they can be covered and have all of the sections and requirements of the produce safety rule apply. And the bucket that you fall into or under depends on dollar sales, and that's average sales over a 3-year period. It also depends on the products you're growing, so the different types of produce and where the produce is being sold, or who your customers are, so how you're selling it. Are you selling it to people at the farmer's market? Are you selling it to a wholesale distributor? Differences like that kind of determine whether you're covered, qualified, exempt, or excluded. So just a little bit more detail on those. If you're selling less than $25,000 in produce per year, you're 100% excluded from the produce safety rule, so none of the requirements apply. If you have sales between $25,000 and $500,000 in annual food sales, and more than 50% of those are to certain buyers, you could qualify for this exemption, but they are calling the qualified exemption. And that's where 99% of the rule doesn't apply. So if you have $50,000 and you're selling 100% of that produce through the farm stand on your farm and then also to grocery stores in the area within 275 miles, you would be under that qualified exemption. There are several other exclusions and exemptions in the rule. So one of those would be the rarely consumed raw produce isn't covered at all. So as Annalisa mentioned earlier, you know, when you're dealing with produce that you want to keep clean, things like potatoes, they're going on for a kill step. So yes, it's still good to keep them as clean as possible, but you know that they'll be going through some sort of cooking process. So bacteria that got on them most likely will get killed. Things like potatoes that we know are cooked most of the time, I want to say all of the time, but usually there's someone who says they eat potatoes raw. So I'll just say most of the time. Potatoes, sugar beets, pumpkin, squash, things like that, winter squash, I should say. Things that are rarely consumed raw are not covered by the produce safety rule. So if you have a pumpkin patch and that's the only type of produce that you grow, pumpkins are rarely consumed raw, so that's not covered by the produce safety rule. Produce that's destined for a kill step. So the picture on the slide shows tomatoes and then a can of tomato sauce. So those tomatoes are destined to become tomato sauce. It means that they're going through a kill step in that cooking process and canning process. So there again, any microbes of concern that would be on the tomatoes are taken care of in that canning process. So those are also excluded or exempt from the produce safety rule. And the other thing that's on this slide is that note about inflation. So the FDA did put in that these dollar amounts will change with inflation. So when the rule was passed and went into effect in 2015, it was $25,000. At this point, we're up to $26,999, and I think $532,000 something for the other one. $540. There you go. So as inflation affects all of the dollar values in the United States, it also affects the cutoffs for these different categories in the produce safety rule. So this slide lists the produce items that are actually covered by the rule. We have fruits and vegetables, tree nuts, mushrooms, sprouts, peanuts, and herbs. So within that list, in Minnesota, we do have people growing fruits and vegetables. We have people growing tree nuts, but mostly hazelnuts at this point, and those are always cooked before they're eaten, so not covered by the produce safety rule. We do have people growing mushrooms and sprouts and herbs. So we do have a fair number of different different crops that are grown within the state of Minnesota, both indoor and outdoor growers. As it says on the bottom, and like I just mentioned, covered produce does not include things like potatoes and sugar beets that are not eaten raw, items that are no longer at raw agricultural commodities, and they also put into the rule that items grown for personal consumption, in other words, the garden that I have on my patio, not covered by the produce safety rule. So anything that you're growing that you're just planning on eating at home, definitely not going to fall under this rule. Still probably good to keep it as safe as possible. But. Okay, so true or false? Potatoes and sugar beets are covered by the FSMA produce safety rule. Yep, I see 4 people saying no. That is true. Potatoes and sugar beets are not covered by the rule because they are cooked before they're eaten. So the rule also establishes 2 types of farms. So we have primary production farms and then secondary activities farms. Farm activities, so things that can happen on the farm include growing, harvesting, packing, holding. Those are the main activities. There can be drying or dehydrating happening, packaging, labeling, or ripening. Growing only occurs on primary production farms, so that's the main difference between the two. That primary production means a growing location. They can also be doing the other activities at primary production farms, but again, growing will always take place in a primary production farm location. Secondary activities farms are typically harvesting, packing, holding locations for, it could be one farm, it could be multiple plots of land in one area that are all linked, but in order for something to be classified as a secondary activities farm, it has to be under the same ownership as the primary production farm. So the example of that always comes to mind for me is the almond orchards in California, where you'll have 2,000 plus acres of almonds, and they're spread out over 20 miles within the Central Valley, and then there's one location where all of the harvested almonds are brought to dry. And that picture kind of shows an almond windrow, so all the almonds have been placed in one spot, and they're just drying out on the ground. So the orchards are actually the primary production locations, and then there's one secondary activities farm there, which is the location where all of the almonds are placed in the windrows to dry. So this is a completely made up example, but one example of a covered farm, a little bit closer to home. So we have an apple orchard. It has a separate storage location 5 miles down the road under the same ownership. So you've got the orchard itself and then the storage location, primary and secondary farms. The apples are wholesaled to a produce distributor in the cities. The farm also sells sweet corn, pumpkins, and does pick your own raspberries. So out of that list, raspberries and apples are the covered commodities, and the total sales for the farm are $400,000. So remember, our categories are $25,000 with inflation or less, between $25,000 and $500,000, and then $500,000 and up. So we're in that middle category right now, $400,000. But when we break that down a little bit farther, we have sales of $300,000 to that produce distributor in the cities. So more than 50% of this farm's sales are going to someone who is not a qualified end user. Therefore, this is a covered farm. If $300,000 in sales were coming out of this orchard through the store that the orchard happens to have on their farm, and $100,000 we're actually going through the wholesaler in St. Paul, at that point, this would not be a covered, well, it would be a covered farm, but it would be under a qualified exemption. So it would not be fully covered by the produce safety rule. So it really comes down to the specific details of each farm location as far as whether they're covered, fully covered, or not covered at all. This is an example of a qualified exempt farm. So we have a diversified vegetable farm owned by 3 families. They're growing lots of things that are covered by the produce safety rule. Lettuce, broccoli, carrots, kale, and Swiss chard actually are all covered. And they have 70 people that buy CSA boxes from them per year. Their total sales are $150,000 average, so we're still in that $25,000 to $500,000 range. But when we break that down farther, their direct sales are $120,000 and their wholesale is $30,000. So there, we've got well over 50% that's going directly to restaurants, grocery stores, or straight to consumers. So this would be a qualified exempt farm. In terms of compliance for the produce safety rule, the FDA broke it out by size. So businesses that are very large, so greater than $500,000 in sales per year, has to comply with this rule earlier than smaller businesses do. Sprouts, again, were broken out because of the higher risk of the crop itself. So the sprout compliance dates actually started last year. And by January of 2019, all sprout operations will need to be in compliance with the rule. Produce we had from January of this year through January of 2020. So we still have a few years to go on that. And then the water compliance dates and a couple of the other sections also had specific rules or specific dates that were clarified. So in summary, for the FSMA produce safety rule, growers may be eligible for an exemption or excluded depending on what they're growing, if they're doing any processing or selling to anyone that's processing in a way that would kill microorganisms that we're concerned about, based on their average annual produce sales, so less than $25,000 or between $25,000 and $500,000, which would be that average annual food sales and sales to qualified end users. But ultimately, we're still encouraging everyone to understand and take action to reduce food safety risks, no matter what the size of the farm, no matter how you're selling. As Annalisa mentioned, there was an outbreak, associated with farmers markets, and outbreaks have an impact on commodity markets for years. And that's not something that we want to see in Minnesota or nationally, but we're pretty focused on the state since that's where we're working right now. So we are really encouraging all growers, no matter what size, whether or not you're covered, to understand what the food safety risks are that are present on the farm and what they can do to reduce those risks. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about our program here in Minnesota. It's a new program at the Department of Agriculture, so we're just starting our 3rd year of developing the program. And the main areas that we focused on are outreach and education, developing a farm inventory, and then more recently building the inspection program. The program itself is focusing on safe production of fruits and vegetables. Our goal would be to reduce foodborne illness factors for everyone that eats Minnesota produce. We're working to develop a program that provides growers outreach, education, food safety information, again, with a lot of partnerships, specifically with the University of Minnesota Extension and also other stakeholders who work closely with produce farmers around the state. We're working to develop culturally aware and respectful partnerships, looking at the diversity of Minnesota's farming community, providing assistance to address any barriers and challenges that growers are finding as they're starting to implement the produce safety rule, And we've set up a way to have structured ongoing communication with our stakeholders and partners, and will be providing assistance and inspections for farms that are covered by the rule starting next summer. So summer of 2019 is when the inspections will start on farms. So just kind of an overview of our development timeline. In year one, we were really focused on farm inventory, so just trying to figure out who was growing what and where in the state. Starting in year two, we were really focusing more on education and outreach, and these things are continuing, as the arrows indicate. So we have grower training courses that will be happening this winter. We had several that happened last winter. We're offering on-farm readiness reviews for farms, and I'll go into that in a little bit more detail, explaining more about what that is. And then the PSAG stands for the Produce Safety Advisory Group. So that's where our program staff are meeting with stakeholders. We're trying to meet quarterly to talk about the way the program is developing and get input, and then work on communications and outreach so that people get messages that they need to hear about the rule and the training and education that's available. And then in year three, the big focus for us now is kind of building our on-farm inspection program. And again, it will be following our compliance schedule that's outlined. So when the farms of certain sizes are falling under the rule, but it's very focused on education first. We will have to do something, obviously, if there's an imminent public health hazard that we find, but otherwise this will be very focused on education going both directions. So as we go out to farms, we'll definitely learn more about what's happening in Minnesota and what people are growing and how, and then hopefully we'll be able to also share education on food safety practices. This is a map of our current produce inventory, so produce farms by county in Minnesota. The white counties right now are indicating that there aren't produce farms within those counties. So we have 85 out of the 87 that have produce farms at the moment. And the darker the color, the more farms there are within those counties. So there are certain areas you can see that have a higher concentration. And our estimate for covered farms within the state is about 500 or 600, and total produce growing farms, the estimate is about 2,000. We did just release a farm inventory questionnaire within the last week and a half. So we sent out a letter several weeks ago to produce farmers that we had addresses for, just letting people know that the produce safety rule, was part of the something that the Department of Agriculture is working on, and what that meant in terms of program development, and then also a request for people to complete the farm inventory questionnaire so that we can help farms understand the rule requirements and help farms understand whether or not they're covered. So kind of the main focus of the questionnaire is to help people identify whether or not they are covered farms. And then it also gives us a way to convey information and resources a little more easily as we work with the university and other partners to develop those resources and get them out to people. So this will be available on our website within the next month or so, but right now we certainly are happy to email out the link to anyone who's interested, and we're very close to having a paper version as well that we can send out. The on-farm readiness reviews are another outreach education opportunity that actually are part of a program that was developed nationally. And the idea is to have someone from the University of Minnesota Extension program and our produce safety program go out to farms together and just walk through looking at practices with the farmer. So the goal would be to help farmers know kind of what an inspection might be like, It's on-farm readiness for the inspection program, but there won't be any notes taken. If there are any notes that either staff from the produce program or extension would take, we would leave all of those with the farmer before we leave. This is definitely not an inspection type situation. It's confidential, it's voluntary, and the real goal of that program is to just help farmers understand what the inspection process might look like, and honestly also to help our inspectors understand a little bit more what it's like to do inspections on a farm. So one thing that farmers do have to do in order to be eligible for an on-farm readiness review is to have one person associated with a farm take the grower training course. As you can see in the little diagram there, you take the grower training course, and then you can have the on-farm readiness review, and then you would hopefully be ready for an inspection against the produce safety rule whenever a compliance state indicates that your farm would be in compliance with the rule. Additional outreach and education that we're doing, again, is this produce safety advisory group. So we're meeting quarterly. It's a way for us to have active communication, and I just listed out some of our current members. We've had a few more join actually since I put this list together. So we have, I think, up to about 10 stakeholder partners now that are committed to working with this advisory group. In terms of the inspection program, we're really working on our paperwork at the moment for the program. So we're developing what to expect during an inspection handout. We're working on an inspection procedure, so an equipment list that we'll need, prioritization, how do we decide which farms to go to first, and then we'll also work on field compliance and enforcement procedures, again, for when we find something that would be, if we find something, I should say, that would be a significant public health concern or a prohibited act. Those are the kinds of conditions where we may have to move to a compliance type situation. But by and large, our inspection procedures and our plan is very focused on education. And then one of the more recent developments also was the water lab work that the University of Minnesota Extension staff have put together. And I think I'm going to pass that back.
Okay. Yeah.
To you? Yep. So then Annalisa will talk a little bit more about the produce safety rule trainings that are coming up this winter, and then I think also touch on the water lab stuff. Okay.
So the trainings are, if you are covered by the rule, you, as she mentioned, are required to send a supervisor, somebody from the farm, to this specific training. So this training is based on curriculum that was developed by the Produce Safety Alliance, which is an alliance of Extension and Cornell University and the FDA developed this one specific curriculum. And it's an 8-hour-long workshop day, and they're being held all over the country. Thousands of farmers have now been trained by this curriculum. So there are, if you've attended a GAPs training in the past or have done other things, this is the only thing that will suffice as per the rule. So you attend, it's 9 to 5, it's one full day, it costs $25. The certificate of attendance is issued by the Association of Food and Drug Officials. It comes to your house a couple months after completion. The Department of Ag or U of M does not issue that certificate. And it is good for life. You only do need to attend one time. Of course, you'll be continually getting updates because part of this rule is not completed yet. So there's a couple aspects of it that you'll have to kind of stay tuned for information on. But you might as well do it now because there is FDA, the Department of Ag is able to subsidize this cost to make it only $25. In the coming years, it will most definitely go up in cost, and they're seeing in other states it going up to multiple hundreds of dollars. So we strongly suggest that you take this training now. If you're a covered farm, most definitely. But even if you think you might be getting bigger or you're selling commercially, this would be a very good idea to take. If you are just starting farming or a tiny farm, you know, it's up to you. You're always welcome. So this is where they will be. There currently is still spots at all of them. Last year, 3 or 4 of our 5 did fill up when we had wait lists on them. So some of the farmers were annoyed that we didn't have more, so we had a lot more. So we have 14 this year all around the state. The goal is to really have it within an hour or two of everybody in the state. And these locations were based on that kind of heat map that Val showed where the locations of the largest growers are. So we've been sending out this link. We sent it out on FSMA, Minnesota Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association newsletter, these kind of places. This link has definitely been sending around. So, poll question. Does every produce farmer, every fruit and vegetable farmer, are they expected to attend this training? Yes or no? Feedback saying no. Correct. Only those that are covered was the term by the law. All right, another resource, we put together a list of water laboratories that will offer water tests that are in compliance with the federal law. This law requires that farmers test their water for E. coli, and that being done by some specific methods. So we called a bunch of these water labs and asked them if they indeed have this method, and then we reported this in a fact sheet, and there's a Google map associated with it. So we just finished that literally like a few days ago. So I'll be sending that around as well, and that will be available to all the farmers at the grower trainings as well. And from the FDA, there are certainly resources. So if you go to the basic FSMA Produce Safety Rule page, you'll find this at-a-glance document, which is the one on the right there, and that is a 7-page kind of digested what some of these basic requirements of the rule are, and then the one on the left is the flow chart that Val kind of verbally walks through about if you're covered or not, so you can remember some of those exemptions. And Produce Safety Alliance, I would strongly suggest them and the FDA if you're looking for, and of course the University of Minnesota Extension and Produce Safety Program at the Department of Ag as kind of your go-to spots to find information on this. There are other nonprofits that might have fact sheets that may or may not be current, and they might have more of a, you know, you just never quite know what people are going to say. But if it's from the Produce Safety Alliance, the U of M, or the Produce Safety Program at the Department of Ag or the FDA, you're good. So these are some of our partners. This has definitely been heavily based in partnerships. So we have just a couple minutes left. Any questions that came up?
So I don't have any in the chat right now, Annalisa, but if people do have questions and want to type them in real quick, please do that. I'll just say, you know, if you have questions or want more information, Annalisa is a really great resource and has a lot of experience in this area, and also has in mind just the fact that her farmers and every farmer is different, and it's not just a cookie cutter answer, and we'll work with people to help figure out what will work for them on their farm. So be aware of that. And then just from my end, also having attended and presented at some of those produce safety rule workshops, they're really good workshops. We've enjoyed working with farmers and doing those presentations and getting feedback from them about just the rules and how to interpret and apply them on the farm. So they tend to be worthwhile events to attend you think it might apply to you, or you want to learn more about it. So I would encourage people to come to those if need be.
Thanks, Jake. Also, I'll say that for those watching this in the future, it looks like I didn't include the actual hyperlink to the registration page, but if you go on either that MDA website or the U of M Extension website, you'll see quickly how to get to register for the training.
Great. Do you want to pass the ball back to me, Annalisa?
Yep.
So this, I believe, is the last for our fall series of Local Foods College. We'll be working on getting things started up again sometime this winter. So stay tuned, and hopefully we'll have another series of these webinars for you all to attend via home. Again, we'll be sending out an evaluation, so please, please, please fill that out. We have a Facebook group that you can join and get updates through that and join the conversation that way. We also are on Twitter. I manage the UMN Small Farms handle, and then the Regional Sustainable Development Partnership of Extension has another handle that you might follow as well. And join us next week. That is a lie. This is the last one for now. But like I said before, we'll be starting up again in the winter. So thank you all who attended live, and for those of you who are watching a recording, thanks for being a part of this, and we hope to see you again soon. So thanks, Annalisa and Valerie. We appreciate your presentation and information. It's really good stuff.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
All right.